Here is a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. How do you know that anything you are experiencing right now is real? Not in the way someone asks that question to be provocative, in the way that philosophers, physicists, and some of the most serious thinkers in technology have asked it with complete sincerity and have not been able to fully answer it. The possibility that the reality you are experiencing is not the base layer, that it is constructed, rendered, that the world you move through every day is, in some sense that you cannot currently detect, a simulation. This is not a new idea. It is a very old idea that has been given new and uncomfortable relevance by where technology is going. And the reason it keeps showing up in philosophy, in physics, in film, and in the conversations of people who build the most advanced computing systems in human history is not because those people are collectively losing their grip on reality. It is because the question they're asking is genuinely difficult to answer. Here's what they didn't tell you about simulation theory. The doubt goes back further than most people realize. In approximately 380 BC, Plato described a thought experiment now known as the allegory of the cave. Prisoners chained in a cave, facing a wall, watching shadows cast by objects they cannot directly see, mistake those shadows for reality. They have no access to the objects themselves, only to the representations. And the thought experiment raises a question that Plato intended as philosophical, but that has not resolved. What if your access to reality is mediated in a way you cannot detect? René Descartes, writing in the 17th century, asked a version of the same question in a different form. What if an evil demon of great power was deceiving him, producing all his sensory experiences artificially, making him believe in a world that did not correspond to any external reality? He used this as a method for stripping away every assumption that could be doubted, and he found that the only thing he could not doubt was the existence of a mind doing the doubting. These are not fringe ideas. They are the foundational texts of Western epistemology, the study of how we know what we know. Pause for a second. Now, fast forward to 2003. Philosopher Nick Bostrom published a paper that took this ancient question and reformulated it in contemporary terms. Bostrom's simulation argument runs as follows. If it is possible for civilizations to develop computing power capable of running detailed simulations of conscious experience, and if some civilizations eventually do this, and if they run many such simulations, then the number of simulated conscious experiences would vastly outnumber the number of non-simulated ones, which means that, statistically, any given conscious experience is more likely to be simulated than not. Bostrom presented this not as a conclusion, but as a trilemma. Either civilizations almost always destroy themselves before reaching the level of computing power required, or advanced civilizations almost never choose to run such simulations, or we are very likely in a simulation right now. He did not resolve which option is correct. The argument is that at least one of those three things must be true. This is not science fiction. It is a logical argument developed by a philosopher at Oxford and has been engaged with seriously by physicists, technologists, and scientists, including Elon Musk, who has publicly stated that the odds we are in base reality are billions to one, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who has said the argument is hard to dismiss. If the same idea keeps showing up in major films, in philosophical texts, in the statements of leading technologists, is it imagination, or is it something people keep returning to for a reason? Because the films did not create the question produced the films. The Matrix, released in 1999, popularized the simulation concept for a mass audience in a way that made it culturally available to people who had not read Plato or Bostrom. But the ideas the film dramatized were already circulating in serious intellectual discourse. The film did not invent the concern, it reflected it, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. The technology dimension of this question has become harder to dismiss with each passing year. The gap between reality and simulation, as a practical matter of what is detectable, has been narrowing in ways that raise the underlying question in a new form. In 1972, the most sophisticated video game in existence displayed a bouncing rectangle on a screen. 50 years later, virtual environments exist that produce photorealistic rendering indistinguishable from photography at certain resolutions and frame rates. The trajectory of that development, if extended even a few more decades, points toward environments that a naive observer could not distinguish from physical reality. Some serious researchers in physics have gone further. A 2012 study by physicists at the University of Bonn proposed a theoretical test for whether the universe is a simulation based on specific predictions about the distribution of high-energy cosmic rays. They could not confirm the simulation hypothesis, but they described a structure that, if the universe were simulated on a lattice computational architecture, would leave a specific kind of detectable signature. The fact that such a test was proposed in a peer-reviewed physics paper is worth noting. If you cannot tell the difference between something real and something simulated, does the difference matter? That question splits into two separate answers depending on what you mean by matter. For practical purposes, if a simulated experience is indistinguishable from a non-simulated one, the behavior of the person experiencing it will be identical. The food tastes the same, the relationships feel the same, the pain is equally painful. In that sense, the difference may not matter for how you live, but the question of what is actually happening beneath the experience is a different kind of question. And if the answer to that question is that the experience is being generated by a process you have no access to, controlled by entities you cannot observe, running on systems whose purposes you do not know, then the difference matters in a very specific way. Not for what you feel, for what you are. Now think about this. There is a category of experience that people describe in which the perceived reality seems to slip slightly. The sense that a situation has occurred before, the coincidence that feels too precise to be random, the moment where the pattern of events seems to exceed what probability would casually produce. These experiences are universal. They are documented across cultures, across history, and across people with very different relationships to ideas about simulation and constructed reality. The scientific explanation for these experiences is cognitive. The brain is a pattern recognition engine that sometimes generates false positives. The sense of having experienced something before is a misfiring of memory retrieval. The coincidence that seems too perfect is a function of the number of events that occur and the tendency to notice and remember the ones that fit a pattern while discarding the ones that do not. That explanation is well grounded and probably correct for the majority of such experiences. The question that simulation theory raises is not whether the cognitive explanation is accurate. The question is whether it is complete. When you notice patterns that feel too perfect or too strange, are you discovering something or creating meaning? The honest answer is that you cannot currently tell, and that inability to tell is not a failure of attention or intelligence. It is a genuine epistemic limitation that applies to everyone. The cognitive explanation describes what happens inside the mind. It does not address what is happening outside it, if anything is. And this is where people start to disagree. Some people find simulation theory liberating. If reality is constructed, then the constraints of the physical world are not as absolute as they appear. The rules are the rules of the simulation, not the rules of some bedrock physical reality, and in principle, the rules of a simulation can be different than they appear. Others find the idea deeply uncomfortable. The thought that the experience of being alive, of loving and losing and building and failing, might be occurring inside a process whose purpose is not oriented toward the experiences it produces, raises questions about meaning and value that do not resolve easily. Both responses are rational, and the fact that the same idea produces such different reactions in different people is itself worth noting. Simulation theory is one of the few ideas that can simultaneously sound like the most interesting thing you have ever heard and like the most disturbing thing you have ever considered. The reframe is this. Simulation theory is not primarily a theory about whether reality is fake. It is a theory about the limits of what we can know about what is actually happening around us. And that question about the limits of what we can know is the underlying thread that runs through everything this channel has covered. Governments operating programs the public could not see, intelligence agencies managing information environments that populations moved through without knowing they were managed, planning documents that shape decisions in ways never visible to the people affected by them. The gap between what is actually happening and what is accessible to observation is not unique to simulation theory. It is the central question of every story we have told. Simulation theory extends that gap to its logical limit. Not just what have governments hidden, not just what do we not know about the decisions being made around us, but what do we not know about the nature of the environment we are inhabiting at the most fundamental level. So here's the question worth sitting with. If there's no way to prove whether reality is real or simulated, what does that say about everything you think you know? And more importantly, how would you even begin to tell the difference? Tell me in the comments what you think, because that question does not have a consensus answer among physicists, philosophers, or anyone else. And the fact that it does not is the most interesting thing about it.